Saul Goodman is one of those characters that somehow transcends the show he came from. In Breaking Bad, he was originally supposed to be a third season guest star. That's it. One and done. Comic relief with a Bluetooth headset. And yet, what Bob Odenkirk did with that character, and what Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould built on top of that performance, gave us one of the most fascinating, heartbreaking, and strangely hilarious character arcs in television history. Saul Goodman became more than just the crooked lawyer who helped Walter White launder money. He became the tragic story of Jimmy McGill, a man who desperately wanted to be good, or at least to be seen as good, but who lived in a world that refused to let him be anything but a scammer. And here's the thing, Bob Odenkirk wasn't supposed to be this guy. He was a comedy writer, a sketch comedian, the Mr. Show guy. He wasn't Bryan Cranston or Giancarlo Esposito, actors with long dramatic resumes. And yet, he might just be the most crucial ingredient in why this entire universe works. So today, we're going to break down exactly how Bob Odenkirk turned what could have been a one-note joke character into one of the most layered, tragic, and weirdly inspiring figures on TV. We're going to follow his entire journey from his very first appearance in Breaking Bad through every slip, scam, and Saul Goodman moment of Better Call Saul, all the way to his black and white afterlife as Gene Takovic. And along the way, we're going to talk about performance. Because Odenkirk doesn't just play Saul Goodman, he performs Saul Goodman. There's Saul Goodman the man, and Saul Goodman the character. And then there's Bob Odenkirk's performing both. But before we get into that character, we need to talk about the man behind the loud suit. One of the best things about Bob Odenkirk's performance as Saul Goodman is that you can feel the comedy in his bones. It's not just that he knows how to land a punchline, it's that he knows how to use comedy as a survival mechanism, as a mask, as a weapon. And the reason he's so good at that is because, well, he spent the first 2 decades of his career doing exactly that. He wrote the Matt Foley motivational speaker sketch. He went on to co-create Mr. Show with Bob and David with David Cross, which was basically a sketch comedy playground for some of the weirdest, smartest comedy of the 90s. That background matters, because Odenkirk learned how to play characters who are just slightly too much, people who are trying too hard or just a little bit desperate, or are performing for an audience that isn't actually there. Comedy taught him timing, which is obvious, but it also taught him something even more important: how to make an audience root for someone who is technically kind of terrible. And that's exactly what he brought to Saul Goodman. Let's rewind to Season 2, Episode 8 of Breaking Bad, titled Better Call Saul. This is where we meet him for the very first time. Picture the scene. Jesse Pinkman and Walt's new Met Enterprise has hit a snag. Badger, one of their dealers, has been arrested. Walt and Jesse are terrified that Badger will flip on them. They need a criminal lawyer. And so we get Saul Goodman. Saul's first scene is in a police interrogation room, and it is perfect. The very first thing we see is his over-the-top persona. The loud suit, the quick patter, the pop culture references. He's practically a cartoon character. But if you pay attention to Odenkirk's performance, you can already see the layers. Watch how Saul moves in that scene. He's fast, he's slick, but he's also reading the room constantly. He's looking for angles, testing boundaries, pushing just enough to see what he can get away with. And when the cops push back, he doesn't fight. He pivots. That's the survival instinct. And then there's the comedy. The jokes aren't just there to be funny, they're there to put everyone off balance. When Saul cracks a joke about defending a murderer who shot someone in the parking lot, he's remembering the cops that he deals with much scarier people than them. It's a flex, disguised as a punchline. This is where Bob Odenkirk's comedic background really shows. He knows exactly how long to hold a beat before delivering a line. He knows how to throw away a joke so it feels like Saul's not even trying that hard. It makes Saul feel like a guy who's been doing this for a long time, who's got a system, who knows exactly who he is. And the best part? He's immediately likable, which is wild because he is obviously a sleazy lawyer who is trying to obstruct justice. But Odenkirk makes him charming. He makes you want Walt and Jesse to hire him. And that's the magic trick. Because Saul Goodman, at his core, is a performance. He is a character that Jimmy McGill invented so that he could survive. And in the very first episode, you can already see Odenkirk playing that double-layered game. Saul Goodman, the persona on top, Jimmy McGill, the human underneath. Why this introduction matters. The first appearance could have been a throwaway gag. A lot of TV shows introduce a wacky side character for a single episode and then forget about them. But Saul was different. Odenkirk made him feel like someone you could build a whole show around. And that's exactly what happened. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Saul Goodman became the guy we know in Breaking Bad, before he became Gene Takovic, he was just Jimmy McGill. A man trying and failing to live up to the expectations of a world that didn't want him. And to understand why that's so heartbreaking, we need to go back. You can't really talk about Saul Goodman without talking about Jimmy McGill, because Saul Goodman doesn't exist without him. If Saul is the mask, Jimmy is the face underneath. And what's fascinating about Better Call Saul is that it doesn't just show you where Saul Goodman came from. It makes you fall in love with Jimmy McGill first. Which means that when Jimmy finally becomes Saul, it doesn't feel like a triumph, it feels like a tragedy. Jimmy McGill starts off as this scrappy underdog, the kind of guy you want to root for. He's funny, he's charming, he's clever, but you get the sense that he's just one good break away from turning things around. And that's the hope. Better Call Saul makes you believe, at least for a little while, that Jimmy could have a happy ending. Let's rewind to Jimmy's backstory. Before he was Saul Goodman, before he was even a lawyer, Jimmy was Slippin' Jimmy, pulling scams with his buddy Marco. This is where Jimmy learns that he's good at two things: talking his way out of trouble and making people like him even as he's screwing them over. But here's the key: he's not malicious, he's not Tuco, he's not even Walter White. Jimmy scams people because it's fun, because it makes him feel clever, because it's a way to get one over in a world that otherwise ignores him. Bob Odenkirk plays this flashback with this twinkle in his eye. You can see the guy who would one day become Saul Goodman, but you also see a kid who just wants to be noticed. And that's what makes Jimmy different from most criminal protagonists. He's not trying to dominate the world, he's just trying to carve out a space for himself in it. And then there's Chuck. Chuck McGill is one of the most brilliantly written obstacles in TV history. He's just a guy who cannot, will not, and maybe even should not trust his brother. Chuck is the one who gave Jimmy his first shot at legitimacy. He helped Jimmy get a job in the mailroom at Hamlin and McGill. He saw potential in him. And when Jimmy passed the bar and became a lawyer, Chuck was there to congratulate him. Sort of. But Chuck never really believed Jimmy could change. He never believed that Slippin' Jimmy could become respectable. And in Chuck's defense, Jimmy doesn't exactly make it easy. Even when he's trying to go straight, Jimmy is always looking for shortcuts, always bending the rules just a little. Bob Odenkirk plays Jimmy's relationship with Chuck with this constant need for approval. Every scene they share is loaded with subtext. Jimmy is smiling, joking, trying to win Chuck over, and you can feel the heartbreak every time Chuck shuts him down. The tragedy of Jimmy McGill is that he wants to be good for Chuck, but Chuck will never see him as good. And the tragedy of Chuck is that he wants Jimmy to be better, but he can't accept him even when Jimmy is better. It's a toxic feedback loop that basically guarantees Jimmy will break bad eventually. The first season of Better Call Saul is basically a one long tug-of-war between Jimmy's better angels and his con-man instincts. On one hand, you see him hustling to get clients, to build his own little legal practice out of a boiler room, to play by the rules. You watch him light up when he finds a case that actually matters, like the Sandpiper case with the nursing home residents. Bob Odenkirk plays those moments with such sincerity that you start to think, hey, maybe this guy really is going to turn his life around. And then, almost in the same breath, you watch him pull a billboard stunt where he stages a fake rescue just to get publicity. It's brilliant, it's funny, and it's also deeply unethical. That's Jimmy in a nutshell. He wants to be legitimate, but he also wants to win. And if bending the rules get him there faster, he'll bend them. This is where Odenkirk's comedic background becomes his secret weapon. Jimmy McGill is genuinely funny. Not sitcom funny, but real person funny. And because he's funny, you forgive him. You want him to succeed even when you know he's cutting corners. Of course, we can talk about Jimmy's early days without talking about Kim Wexler. Kim is not just Jimmy's love interest. She's the person who sees the best version of him. She's the first person who really believes he can be more than just Slippin' Jimmy. And that's a huge deal, because Jimmy's entire arc is whether he can live up to someone else's belief in him. Odenkirk plays Jimmy differently with Kim than with anyone else. Around her, the mask slips. He's more vulnerable, more sincere. You can see the moments where he wants to tell her the truth about what he's done, where he wants to be better for her, and for a while it works. Jimmy actually becomes a better lawyer when he's trying to impress Kim. But the flip side of that is when Kim joins him in his schemes, it validates the worst parts of him. It makes him think that con artist side of his personality is not just acceptable, but attractive, and that's going to matter a lot later. Here's where Better Call Saul does something genius. It makes Jimmy's funniest moments his saddest moments. When Jimmy pulls a scam, you laugh, because Odenkirk is charming, because the writing is clever, because you're in on the joke. But then, when the dust settles, you realize what that scam cost him. A little more of Chuck respect, a little more of Kim's fate, a little more of Jimmy McGill's soul. And Odenkirk sells every bit of that. You can watch the smile fade from his face when he realized he's hurt someone. You can watch him double down anyway, because admitting defeat would mean admitting that Chuck was right about him all along. The genius of this part of the show is that it makes you root for Jimmy and fear for him at the same time. You want him to win, but you also want him to stop before he loses himself completely. By the end of season 2, he's halfway between being the good lawyer he wants to be and the criminal lawyer he's destined to become. The name change to Saul Goodman is coming, but it hasn't happened yet, and that's why this part of the story is so compelling. Because you know exactly where he's going, but you don't know exactly when he's going to make that final leap. Odenkirk's performance is the tightrope act that makes it work. He never let Jimmy become completely unlikable, even when Jimmy does something shady. Odenkirk gives you just enough humanity to keep you invested. And that means that when he finally does become Saul Goodman, it's not a celebration, it's a funeral. When you look back at Better Call Saul as a whole, part 3 is the act where the tone shifts. If the early seasons were about asking, can Jimmy stay good? Then this part is where we get the answer. And the answer is no. This is the tragedy of Jimmy McGill. Not that he never had a chance, but that he did. For a brief moment, he had a shot at being the man Kim saw in him, at being a legitimate lawyer, at leaving Sleeping Jimmy behind. And he chose to go the other way. This is also where the show becomes electric. Because watching Jimmy embrace Saul Goodman is like watching someone put on armor. It's thrilling, it's horrifying, and it's Bob Odenkirk's at his absolute peak. The thing about Saul Goodman is that it's not just a name change, it's an entirely new identity. When Jimmy decides to practice law as Saul Goodman, he's not just trying to get clients, he's rewriting who he is. This is where you start to notice the performance within the performance. Odenkirk plays Saul Goodman as someone who is always on. The patter is faster, the gestures are bigger, the suits get louder. It's like watching Jimmy put on a costume every day, and eventually forgetting how to take it off. But here's what's brilliant about Odenkirk's performance. You can still see Jimmy underneath. It's in the way Saul hesitates before telling a lie, or the way his smile flickers when something genuinely upsets him. Saul Goodman might be a persona, but Odenkirk never lets you forget that Jimmy McGill is still in there, somewhere, quietly drowning. And this is where we get some of the most fun moments in the show. The commercials, the colorful office decor, the phone book ads. Jimmy is having the time of his life being Saul Goodman, and you as the audience get swept up in it too. And that's exactly why the darker moments hit so hard. Kim Wexler is the heart of Better Call Saul. For most of the show, Kim is Jimmy's moral compass. She's the one who encourages him to stick to the straight and narrow, to put his talents to good use. But slowly, season by season, you can watch Kim start to enjoy the scam life just a little too much. Bob Odenkirk and Rhea Seehorn have ridiculous chemistry here. Watch how Jimmy lights up when Kim agrees to pull a con with him. You can see it in his body language. He straightens up, gets more playful, more confident. It's not just that he loves Kim, it's that he loves who he gets to be with Kim. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Because Kim isn't just enabling Jimmy, she's actively encouraging him. She's smart, careful, and usually better at covering her tracks than he is. Together they become the unstoppable force. Two brilliant people using their powers for chaos. The climax of this arc is of course the plan to ruin Howard Hamlin. This is their magnum opus as con artists. It's elaborate, it's cruel, and it works perfectly. And the fallout is catastrophic. When Howard dies, and it is largely because of Jimmy and Kim's scheme, you watch Odenkirk's performance go dead still. He's not just shocked, he's shattered. But here's the kicker. He doesn't change course. If anything, Howard's death locks Saul Goodman into place permanently. Because the only way Jimmy can live with what is done is to stop being Jimmy. Enter Lalo Salamanca. If Howard's death is the emotional turning point of the show, Lalo is the practical one. After Lalo forces Jimmy to become his errand boy, after he sends him into the desert to go pick up cartel money, Jimmy is no longer just playing in the gray areas. He's fully in the game now. This is where Bob Odenkirk's performance takes on a whole new dimension. Jimmy is traumatized. You can see it in the way he can't sleep, the way he flinches at loud noises, the way his jokes suddenly feel like they're covering something much darker. This is where the line between Jimmy and Saul starts to blur completely. Saul Goodman is no longer just a persona for the courtroom. It's a shield Jimmy uses to keep himself from feeling anything. And Odenkirk sells it with such subtlety. It's not a big, dramatic switch. It's a slow suffocation. By the time we get to the Breaking Bad timeline, Saul Goodman is fully formed. The suits, the office, the commercials, all of it is in place. And Jimmy McGill as we knew is gone. Here's what's so genius about this part of the story. It makes you complicit. You like Saul Goodman. He's fun. He's charming. Gets results. He's the underdog sticking it to the system. And yet, when you step back and look at what he's actually doing, enabling a drug empire, destroying lives, covering up murders, it's horrifying. That's why Bob Odenkirk's performance is so crucial here. If Saul Goodman were just a cartoon, you wouldn't feel guilty about rooting for him. But Odenkirk makes sure you can still see the man underneath. He makes sure you remember that this isn't just some random slick lawyer. This is Jimmy McGill, the guy who wanted to help all people get justice, the guy who loved Kim Wexler, the guy who used to believe in something. And that's why the fall hurts so much. By the end of part 3, Saul Goodman is in full bloom, and it's exhilarating. The suits are brighter, the jokes are sharper. You can't help but enjoy it. But if you're paying attention, you start to notice that Jimmy's world is getting darker. Friends are gone, Kim is gone, Howard is dead, Chuck is dead, Nacho is dead. The list of casualties keeps growing. And Jimmy keeps smiling, keeps joking, keeps moving forward. Because the only alternative is to stop and face what is become. This is the power of Better Call Saul. It makes you cheer for the transformation even as it quietly breaks your heart. And it's the power of Odenkirk's performance that you can hold both of those feelings in your head at the same time. At this point in the story, Saul Goodman is ready to walk into Breaking Bad. He's the guy Walt and Jesse will meet. But now you know what it cost to get here. You know what Jimmy had to sacrifice to become this person. And that means that when we revisit Saul in Breaking Bad, he's no longer just comic relief. He's a tragic figure hiding in plain sight. When you first watched Breaking Bad, Saul Goodman was a welcome break from the show's intensity. He was the guy who breezed in with a joke, got Walt and Jesse out of trouble, and then disappeared until they needed him again. He was comic relief. But after Better Call Saul, you can't see him that way anymore. Now, every time Saul Goodman cracks a joke, you can hear the pain behind it. Every time he gives Walt advice, you can see Jimmy McGill silently begging not to get dragged any deeper into this world. The character hasn't changed, but your understanding of him has. And that's where the magic of Bob Odenkirk's performance really shines. Rewatching Breaking Bad after Better Call Saul is like rewatching tragedy in reverse. You already know the ending, you know where Saul came from, what he lost, who he used to be, and now you get to watch him try and fail to keep the mask on. Bob Odenkirk plays Saul with a level of confidence in Breaking Bad that's completely earned by the time we reach this point. The patter is faster, the jokes are sharper, the schemes are bolder. Saul is operating at a peak efficiency here. He knows how to clean up any mess Walt throws at him, and he does it with such flair. But look closer and you start to see the cracks. One of the most fascinating things about Saul in Breaking Bad is how often he's terrified. And not just quote-unquote scared of getting shot, terrified. Existentially terrified. When Saul meets Walt and Jesse for the first time, he's calm, collected, even cocky. But when he gets taken out into the desert and forced to kneel in front of them, you can see genuine fear flash across Odenkirk's face. This isn't the fear of a man who's new to danger. This is the fear of a man who's been in danger before and knows exactly how bad this could get. And yet, even in that moment, Saul performs. He bargains, he cracks jokes, he buys himself time. That's Jimmy McGill's survival instinct kicking in. And once Walt and Jesse let him live, Saul becomes an indispensable part of their operation. Not because he wants to, but because he has no choice. The same survival instinct that kept him alive in the desert now keeps him tethered to Walt's empire. One of the most brilliant things about Saul in Breaking Bad is that he's just moral enough to feel bad, but not moral enough to walk away. You see this in moments like when Walt wants to poison Brock. Saul is visibly uncomfortable with this idea. He even protests, which is rare for him, but he still goes along with it. Because deep down, Saul believes he doesn't get to say no. And this is where Odenkirk's performance adds so much depth. Watch how he delivers those lines. He doesn't play Saul as a man gleefully enabling Walt's worst impulses. He plays him as someone trying to keep that plate spinning just long enough to get out alive. That doesn't make Saul innocent, far from it. He profits off Walt's crimes, he launders the money, he hides the bodies, he knows exactly what kind of man Walt is. And he stays anyway. But it does make him tragic, because you can tell that part of him knows this is going to end badly, and he can't stop it. Another interesting thing about Saul in Breaking Bad is that he starts to feel more like caricature as the series goes on. His office gets more ridiculous, his jokes gets more outlandish, his hairline somehow gets more suspicious. At first glance, you might think that's just because Breaking Bad was written before Better Call Saul, and Saul was supposed to be a lighter character. If you look at it in context, it actually works perfectly as a character choice. Saul Goodman gets louder and funnier because Jimmy McGill is disappearing. The brighter the suit, the darker the man wearing it. It's camouflage. The comedy gets bigger so that the pain underneath can stay hidden. Odenkirk leans into this in a way that makes the eventual downfall in Better Call Saul's final season hit even harder. Because when you finally see Jin Takovic strip off the suit and the office and the hair, it feels like all that color was just a distraction. Of course, we have to talk about Walt. Saul Goodman is one of the only characters who actually gets Walter White. He sees through the family man act immediately. He knows Walt is in this for himself, and he calls him on it, repeatedly. And yet, he stays loyal. Why? Because Walt is good business. Because Walt makes Saul feel useful. Because Walt is another problem to solve. And Jimmy McGill loves solving problems. The tragedy is that Saul can see the danger coming and still can't get out of the way. By the time Walt's empire collapses, Saul has to go on the run. And that's how we get Gene. This is why Better Call Saul is such a brilliant prequel. Because it doesn't just tell you who Saul Goodman used to be. It changes how you see him in every single Breaking Bad scene. When Saul says if you're committed enough, you can make any story work. It's no longer just a funny throwaway line. It's the philosophy of Jimmy McGill's entire life. When Saul jokes about disappearing and starting fresh, it's no longer just an option. It's a prophecy. You can almost hear Jimmy McGill screaming from deep inside. And that's what makes revisiting Breaking Bad after Better Call Saul such a bittersweet experience. Because now, every laugh is tinged with sadness. You know where Saul came from. You know what he lost. You know what it cost him to be this guy. By the time Breaking Bad ends, Saul Goodman has vanished. The mask is gone. The man underneath is hiding in Omaha, scooping Cinnabon frosting onto pastries and waiting for the day someone recognizes him. And that's where we go next, to Jin Takovic, the quiet, black and white afterlife where Jimmy McGill has to finally face what is done. If Saul Goodman is the performance and Jimmy McGill is the man, then Jin Takovic is the ghost. Saul Goodman, the man who always had a scheme, who always had a quip, who was always moving 3 steps ahead, is now working at a Cinnabon, has got a name tag and a 1,000-yard stare. It's funny, but it's also incredibly bleak. The Gene timeline is one of the boldest storytelling choices Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould ever made. Most prequels wouldn't dare show you the ending up front. And the ending is this. Jimmy McGill got away, Saul Goodman escaped the law, he's not in prison, he's not dead, he's free, and he is miserable. Bob Odenkirk plays Gene with this hollowed out quality. He moves slower, he speaks quieter, even his jokes, when he makes them, sounds like they're coming from someone who doesn't believe them anymore. This is where the lack of color really hits you. The world of Saul Goodman was bright and loud and full of motion. The world of Gene Takovic is drained, silent, and suffocating. And here's the brilliant thing. For a long time, Gene is barely in the show. We get a few minutes at the beginning of each season, just enough to remind you that this is where Jim is headed. It's a constant reminder that no matter how fun the scams get, no matter how charming Saul becomes, this is the end of the road. One of the most heartbreaking Gene moments comes when he sits alone in his apartment and watches old Saul Goodman commercials. On the surface, it's a nostalgic nod for fans. But if you watch Odenkirk's face, you can see Jimmy going through every stage of grief in 30 seconds. He smiles, he laughs, he almost cries. It's the moment when you realize that Saul Goodman wasn't just a persona he used to scam people. It was the happiest Jimmy McGill ever was. And now that persona is dead, and Jimmy is in mourning. And then Gene breaks bad. After years of living like a ghost, he decides to pull off one more scam. And this is where you see that Saul Goodman was never completely gone. He was just waiting for an excuse to come back. The scam itself is a genius, of course. Gene seduces Jeff and Buddy into helping him rip off rich marks by getting them drunk and memorizing their credit card numbers. It's classic Sleeping Jimmy. Clever, low-tech, and just risky enough to feel thrilling. And for a few glorious minutes, you see Gene light up again. He smiles, he cracks jokes, he's alive. But then it all unravels. This is where the tragedy of Jimmy McGill becomes unavoidable. Because Gene doesn't just stop when the scam works. He keeps pushing. He risks everything, not because he needs to, but because he can't help himself. Bob Odenkirk plays this with kind of manic desperation. Gene isn't having fun anymore. He's addicted. He's clawing at one last chance to feel like Saul Goodman again, even if it destroys him. When Gene finally gets caught, you think for a second that he's going to talk his way out of it. And in true Saul Goodman fashion, he negotiates an absurdly light sentence for himself. He's on the verge of pulling off his greatest con yet, the con that will save Saul Goodman. Then he sees Kim. This is where everything stops. Bob Odenkirk's performance in this moment is one of the best of his career. You can see Jimmy McGill take over. You can see Saul Goodman fade away. Instead of taking the deal, Jimmy confesses. He admits everything. He tells the court how he helped Walt build his empire, how he laundered money, how he kept the whole machine running. He doesn't do it to save himself. He does it to tell the truth, maybe for the first time in his life. And in that moment, you realize that Jimmy McGill has been there all along. The final scene of Better Call Saul is a quiet conversation between Jimmy and Kim. They share a cigarette, just like they did in the very first episode. It's black and white, but for a moment, it almost feels like they're scholar again. Jimmy is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Saul Goodman is gone, Jimmy McGill is at peace. And the reason that scene hits so hard is because of everything Bob Odenkirk has built over the course of both shows. It's taken you from Sleepin' Jimmy to Saul Goodman to Gene Takovic, and finally back to Jimmy McGill again. It's a full circle moment. Not a happy ending, but a fitting one. If Better Call Saul had ended with Jimmy fully embracing Saul, it would have been a tragedy. But by giving us Gene, by giving us the chance to watch Jimmy reckon with his past, the show gives him a shot at redemption, and Odenkirk absolutely sticks the landing. His performance in those final episodes is quiet, restrained, almost meditative. It's not the loud, flashy Saul Goodman we remember. It's the man behind the mask, finally willing to live with the consequences of what is done. Gene Takovic might be a ghost, but by the end of the series, Jimmy McGill feels alive again. When you step back and look at Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad as one giant, interconnected story, you start to notice that Saul Jimmy is the perfect character to carry its themes. This is a story about morality, about the choices we make and the justifications we tell ourselves. Walter White shows us how ego can destroy a man. Jesse Pinkman shows us what guilt can do to a soul. And Jimmy McGill, he shows us what happens when you try to turn morality into a negotiation. Jimmy's whole worldview is built on loopholes. If he can just find the right words, the right scam, the right angle, then he can bend reality to his will. And for a while it works. He wins cases he shouldn't win, pulls off cons that shouldn't work, and talks his way out of situations that should have gotten him killed. But the tragedy of Jimmy McGill is that you can't negotiate with the truth forever. Eventually it catches up with you. And that's what makes his final confession so powerful. It's the one time he stops trying to game the system. One of the most fascinating things about Jimmy, Saul, Gene is that he's not just a man, he's three men. You get Jimmy McGill, the hustler who wants to go straight. You get Saul Goodman, the performance who wants to win at any cost. And you get Gene Takovic, the ghost who just wants to disappear. What Bob Odenkirk does so brilliantly is make all three of these identities feel distinct, but connected. You believe that they're the same man, even though they speak differently, move differently, and look at the world differently. That's what makes the ending hit so hard. Because Jimmy doesn't just revert to who he used to be, he becomes something new. He's Jimmy McGill, but he's also Saul and Gene. He's a man who's lived all three lives, and now he finally accepts all of them. It's impossible to talk about Saul Goodman without talking about comedy. Saul is funny, genuinely funny. He's the guy who can break the tension with a one-liner. The guy who can make you laugh in the middle of a drug deal gone wrong. And that's what makes him so dangerous. Because comedy makes you root for him. Bob Odenkirk's background in sketch comedy is what makes this character work. He knows how to sell a joke. He also knows when to let the joke curdle into something darker. There's a moment in season 6 where Saul is trying to cheer Kim up after Howard's death. And it's almost unbearable to watch. The jokes feels hollow. The charm feels forced. And that's when you realize that Saul Goodman isn't just a persona. He's a coping mechanism. This is why comedy can be so tragic. Because when Saul is at his funniest, it's usually at his most desperate. Another big theme running through this show is capitalism. Or more specifically, how people like Jimmy survive in a world that seems rigged against them. Jimmy becomes Saul because Jimmy doesn't pay. The straight and narrow path gets him punished, humiliated, held back. But the minute he leans into Saul Goodman, the money starts rolling in. And that's the uncomfortable truth the show leaves you with. The system rewards Saul. The system doesn't want Jimmy McGill, the guy who actually cares about his clients and wants to do the right thing. It wants Saul Goodman, the guy who can exploit every loophole and make the machine run smoother. That's why Jimmy's final act of confession is so radical. He stops playing the game, he stops trying to win, and in doing so, he finds something that looks a lot like peace. When you look at the history of television, there are a handful of performances that feels truly era-defining. James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, Bryan Cranston as Walter White, Jon Hamm as Don Draper, Bob Odenkirk as Jimmy, Saul, Gene deserves to be in that conversation. Think about what Odenkirk had to do here. He had to take a comic relief side character from Breaking Bad and turn him into a tragic center of a 6-season drama. He had to make you laugh. then make you cry, then make you reflect on your own morality, often in the same episode. And he did it with subtlety. He never overplays the emotion, he never turns Saul into a caricature, even when the character himself is acting like one. He always lets you see the man underneath. The result is a performance that feels both massive and intimate at the same time. So what's the takeaway here? The legacy of Jimmy McGill isn't just that he became Saul Goodman, or that he went to prison, or that he confessed. It's that he lived a life that forced you, the audience, to think about your own choices. Would you have done what Jimmy did if you were in his position? Would you have taken the deal? Would you have confessed? The best television doesn't just entertain you, it haunts you. And Jimmy McGill haunts you because he feels real. He feels like someone you know. He feels like someone you could be. The last image of Better Call Saul is Jimmy behind bars, giving Kim the finger guns one last time. It's not flashy, it's not triumphant, it's quiet. And that's exactly right, because in that moment, Jimmy isn't performing, he isn't selling, he isn't scamming, he's just saying goodbye. In the end, the story of Jimmy McGill isn't just the story of a crooked lawyer. It's the story of a man trying to figure out who he really is, and paying the price for every wrong turn he took along the way. It's about morality, it's about identity, it's about love and loss, and the stories we tell ourselves to get through the day. But most of all, it's about the mask, and what happens when you finally take it off.